This is Zero Signal, where security leaders stop waiting for certainty and start leading through it. I'm Conor Sherman.
And I'm Stuart Mitchell.
Let's get into it. Zero Signal is brought to you by Sysdig. Threat actors are compromising cloud accounts in under 8 minutes. Vulnerabilities are being exploited within 10 hours of disclosure. That's the defender's window, and it keeps closing. Attackers aren't waiting on dashboards. They go straight for what's running. Real time is the only timeline that matters. And that's why Forrester named Sysdig a leader in its latest wave for the cloud-native application protection platforms. Runtime is where real risk shows up, and runtime is what Sysdig is built for. So stop watching and start defending. Learn more at sysdig.com and check out the link in the description. Today on Zero Signal, we're speaking with Ayoub Fandi, the creator of the GRC Engineering Movement, author of GRC Engineering Newsletter, read by over 2,300 security and compliance practitioners, and was recently a speaker at RSA 2026. Today, we're going to be diving in why your audit program is lying to you, how to build a GRC like a data product, and what happens when frontier AI labs start eating the compliance stack, so that you as a security leader can transform your GRC function from an audit prep machine into an engineering program that gives you real-time risk visibility and earns you a seat in a strategic conversations across the business. Ayoub, thank you for joining. Welcome to the show.
Appreciate it. Wow, that was a great intro. Very dramatic in the best way possible. So yeah, very excited. I love the agenda we have. And yeah, let's make GRC a little bit less boring.
Love it. I love it. Let's bust right into it. All right, dude. So I want to just start with one of the things that I loved about reading in one of your recent newsletters, which was this idea that the audit program is lying to you. So you've published a finding that the typical SOC 2 audit, the auditor is going to sample like 25 pull requests out of 2,400. But the attestation is going to say you have 100% coverage. Help me understand what the gaps here. Why is this a practice? And what does this mean for security leaders who are relying on that attestation or a certification to make risk-based decisions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the kind of history of audits came through the more of the financial auditing side, right? So in financial audits, you want to know if someone is cooking the books, right? And they developed the methodology, it was like decades ago, right? Before even the Enron days, to kind of determine if it was likely that someone kind of like falsified some transactions. And they were like, if we sample from different parts of the books, we should be able at some point to find the pattern. And this number of 25, which is still used today, kind of came up. And there was some high level kind of analysis that said, it should be good enough. And then SOX happened, and then all the other frameworks. And then now we also have to audit on the security side, and we leverage the same principle that were used for financial audits. So then you go prepare for like an audit in like SOC 2 or ISO, and then you come to like controls around like, do you have merge request approvals, or you have least privilege enforced in your source code repository? And then they'll say, we need a population, could be like 10, 15,000. And then they just pick 25 and then review the actual details. Like, is someone different from the person who pushed the code, approved it, etc. And I think the issue there is like at the velocity at which the threat actors are moving, especially now, we don't want to talk about mythos and all these things, right? But like there's a different kind of speed now at which kind of attackers moving. When you only sample such a small size, especially at like the number of lines of code pushed nowadays, and then at the end of the day, you test that control. If the 25 pass, they say we have reasonable assurance through the means of testing that we used, but the certificate has your company's logo on it.
Right.
So they won't say, we only tested 25, okay? So you can trust it for like 0.07% of the total infrastructure. They say XYZ company is SOC 2 attested, right? Which means there's there's an abuse in terms of the trust factor because so many of those technical controls have been sampled. And I think if you're on the third-party risk management team, and then you have to determine like, should we actually onboard this vendor? Like so many of the trust signals that you leverage are actually low assurance if you think about any other pull request that might have got crazy stuff in there. Maybe SaaS was not like turned on or whatever, but you didn't see them because the auditor didn't see them. I think that's where the trust breaks down and it's inherent limitations of the current way we do auditing.
I love how you phrase that. the abusal of the trust signals. That is just so true. We put so much weight, these like load-bearing walls on risk management for enterprise risk management, and you get down to the data and you're like, oh, you're at 0.07% sample rates on this.
And think about it, like for some control domains, like at some point, if you think about like infrastructure where you destroy and recreate infrastructure at any point, like if you have to check like at runtime how things are doing, like you could have like clusters with, I don't know, tens of thousands of nodes. And same if you use 25, like at some point it's meaningless. And that's where like I think people who are more technical by nature or work in security but not in GRC, they can understand those trade-offs. But because the people who consume them, they might be in third-party risk management, they just say it's the least worst we have, which is a bit sad, but it's probably true as well.
Do you think that drives a pretty big disconnect? Because GRC fits under almost every program's like CISO org, right? Do you think that drives GRC from other like CorpSec, AppSec, Endpoint, who are very granular, right? GRC sees everything. So do you think that drives a bit of a disconnect between these teams?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say like two big ways in which this disconnect exists. I think the first way is a lot of CISOs, they became a bit cynical. They were like, okay, we have all those security teams who actually care about threat actors, who care about like, we have to have 100% scope. You can't say you have like an EDR solution and we only have 50% of endpoints because it's enough. We just sampled like the most risky endpoints and we just had them. You have to have full coverage. Same for code base. Like you want to make sure your SaaS or whatever you're using, like the AppSec team would not want like to have only half the PRs in scope. But in GRC, like because of the audit process, we do that more. And I think the CISOs, they understand now GRC more as like a sales enablement function, where it's like, okay, we get those certs. Okay, we get ISMAP, which means then we can sell in Korea, or IRAP, we can sell in Australia. So it's almost like we're arm of the sales function. And then the CISO can leverage that to say, we impact the bottom line, give me more money. So I invested elsewhere, not in GRC. I'll invest it in actually getting maybe a CSPM or other stuff.
So I want to come back to that second on the sales piece. I think this is a really important piece, but but I also want to pull on a technical piece. So I'm going to take us down the technical piece in a second, but I'll leave you. We'll come back to the sales piece because I really do believe that for most organizations, compliance is Latin for cash. It's permission to sell. That's actually what it means. So I want to get your take on that in a second. But like, talk to me about the technical side of this. I'm really intrigued in this. Like, I can't really shake this number. And like, Kenny, you're haunting me here. So like, let's go back to that number. What do we do about this? Right? You said earlier, like a SOC 2 is basically the least worst thing that we have when it comes to trying to communicate, yes, you can trust me. We're in a whole different technology world today. I don't want to just use the word like we can AI everything, but like we look at this and we're like, this feels like we are set up for like the load bearing walls of yesteryear are going to collapse. At the very same time, the very same technology could help us bring some rebarb and reinforce that wall. What's your take here on like, what do we do about this and really move this into a trust signal that we can rely on?
Compliance has been put on a pedestal is because we need it to sell. So who is going to actually prove that? It's the TPRM teams, which means third-party risk is actually almost the sole reason of existence for compliance. We get compliant also for regulators if you're a public company or if you have like PCI data. But for the other frameworks like ISOs, the SOC 2s, like we get them because I'm a startup, I want to sell to enterprises. So TPRM is actually the golden knot. That's where all the stuff is happening. And I think for me, like solving the TPRM side is more important because I'm a TPRM team. There's two ways of thinking about TPRM is like assurance driven.
Do you want to just define that terminology for anyone who hasn't read an acronym?
Of course. So TPRM means third-party risk management. So it's a function that often sits on the GRC, and their role is to kind of review new vendors. Often it will be SaaS, but it could be professional services, and they have to make a decision on like how secure that vendor is, and they based it on some kind of data they have. So it could be reports like SOC 2 or ISO, could be a pen test result, could be a questionnaire, which is unfortunate. So they use all those kind of vectors, and then they determine is it low risk, like high risk, and then that vendor gets onboarded, and then they use the tool. So it could be anything. So the issue with TPRM is there's a TPRM version that cares about assurance. We want to get the highest level of signal on the security side from this process. And there's another type of TPRM that is like CYA. It's like, okay, we don't want to get caught not having the SOC 2 of every one of our vendors. So we ask all of them, we send all of them the questionnaire. And then it's mostly a procurement function. So it's like similar to like we need finance in the procurement cycle. You need maybe privacy. You need like security is there, but that team is mostly just saying, okay, we checked, it's fine, reasonable assurance, and then they onboard the vendor, and then whatever could happen, right? Because they get breached, could like maybe they expend the privileges. The data is a lot more than what they said when they signed the contract, but you have no way of really knowing that. So for me, why TPRM is important is because the incentives start there. That they're the team that actually buys that, and often they're enterprise, so they're bigger than the companies they're trying to buy in many cases. So for me, I'm like, what do I need? I need signals from key control domains, and I need to trust those signals, and I need a way to also ensure I know if something changes or something like gets like more or less risky. So I built something that's open source called Corsair, which is like not that good, but just trying to think about it in the right way. For me, I'm like, I want to allow someone to share with me some public or hidden in their like crypto algorithm, like some data about how the control operating. And me as a TPRM team, I can consume that and make a risk-based decision on actual output from tools versus just like reviewing the report, because the report has been reviewed by a CPA or by an attested auditor, but there's so much context that I miss, right? And one big thing for me is I think about third-party risk as an extension of first-party risk. So whatever your company is weak at, it compounds with your vendors. So maybe identity is like an insane big issue at your company. You might just grill your vendors more on identity. But the auditor, they don't know that you care about identity because they audited the company you're trying to buy their software. So then you can go 3 levels deeper on identity, and maybe encryption you don't care as much, so you go less deep. But external certs like SOC 2 or whatever, like they test the controls at the same layer everywhere. So you don't have the way as you as the consumer to kind of like tweak those levers.
That makes sense. So dive into this a little bit more. Like you mentioned assurance. Like walk us through this. If you're a security leader right now and you are kind of fed up with basically procurement offices in one organization driving the security standards of procurement offices of another organization, and you want to take this data and get real signal out of it in this moment of AI, when I hold the belief we are quickly collapsing into a trust economy. If you cannot trust me, you will not buy from me, you will not sell to me. Like everything's about trust, and this is a way that the security team shows up. So, what does that look like? Are we heading into a world of continuous assurance? If you agree, would you mind unpacking that idea? I'd love to get your take on that.
So we would really want to have continuous assurance from our vendors. I think it's the objective. I think there's a lot of barriers. I think first barrier is probably legal, because if you enforce in all your big contracts that you'll have all those controls always operating, and then at some point they stop operating, they could just take a screenshot and get a lot of money out of you. So you're liable, which means there's some barriers that we need to overcome. We try to solve it with trust centers, where you have a web page that showcases how, but it's a marketing page, it's not really a security page, which means you don't really get much out of it. And I think if you want to be a security leader that tries to push TPRM to be more of that like continuous assurance, or at least provide more assurance in the process, I think you first need to really understand like what your company cares about, because you can't just send like a box standard questionnaire and 90% of the questions either you don't read or you don't even know what they're asking. Get it down to maybe 10, 15 questions. But the way you ask them showcases like the actual care. And I think there's a sweet spot. Big vendors like AWS, there's no way you send them a questionnaire. Like they have all the leverage. They just say accept as is or use someone else. Very small vendors, a lot of them, they don't even have a security team. They don't even have anyone. And there's that sweet spot where they're small, but they're very critical for you. So especially now at the AI age, there's companies that might have like 20 people, but they might have an insane amount of data coming from you that they leverage to provide you an AI service. So here you have both like a small team where you can actually enforce, like you have to answer my questions. And also like the way they actually like provide your service is very critical. So if you have that combination, you as the consumer, you have enough leverage to like dig deeper. Okay, instant response. Okay, how does it look like? Okay, encryption in transit. Okay, just give me like the ciphers you use. And they actually most likely would want you to be a customer because it's a big percentage of the overall ARR mix. So you have the ability to really impact like the assurance of your company that way. but you actually have to know when it happens. So I think there's a sweet spot now coming with all the AI vendors where you can actually showcase like a story where you really helped. Okay, actually like told them, to have better encryption transit here, or like have stronger controls around like the offboarding process through the MDM, and then they actually enforced them, and then they shared back the news with us, and you made the internet a safer place.
I do see this quite a bit. I think in like I get the beauty of looking at a lot of the security programs around the world. Security assurance is a terminology used by some of the very best, right? And I look at some of the the Netflixes of the world and Salesforces, GitHubs, GitLabs as an example of really good security assurance platforms. Most teams don't even know what this means, and I think this terminology is really utilized. And I think it's always good to look at what are the best programs doing. I get that some businesses might not be able to afford the people or to drive these ideologies. But this terminology has been around for a few years, but only really in the leading 0.5% of security programs that I've seen worldwide.
I don't like too many acronyms. There's GRC, there's so many, but I think assurance is a better way of describing what we do than just GRC, because GRC is kind of a legacy term that is a couple of decades old. But assurance really showcases that we need to provide trust in our security program to all of our stakeholders. It could even be internal, but it really showcases the trust factor in the process. Whereas GRC is a little bit it's abstract. We don't really know what governance means. Define governance. Okay, it's not easy.
It also I don't know, if you walk in the room and say, "Hey, we're the GRC team," there's a little bit of rolled eyes. Even if I look at the way my team respond when I'm like, "Hey, we have a GRC search," they roll their eyes a little bit. It's not fun. It's not exciting in most instances.
Yep.
And so I think can't rebrand entirely, but I think assurance is language, or and even compliance engineering is somewhat closer. But you're right, assurance is what great organizations, particularly software companies, right? This probably doesn't exist in manufacturing, but software companies, the assurance piece is really the right language and the right approach.
Stu, I would actually challenge that slightly and say, I think assurance shows up. And I think assurance is in every industry. We just kind of get oriented around the tech scene because of cybersecurity, but the assurance on physical manufacturing is going to be there. Isn't it ISO 9900? That's all around that, if I get that one. But yeah, so I think, but you're right. It's this is why I wanted to bring that up, is because every part of the economy requires that the person in their supply chain delivers what they expect, when they expect it, how they expect it. And that's called assurance, and it's all different terminologies. And now we're kind of cybersecurity kind of catching up would be a different way of thinking to the physical space.
That's true. When I open my Chase app, I want assurance that my money is there every single day. So
there you go.
If ever there is the most extreme example, it's financial assurance.
I want my bridges to work, my car to turn on, my money to be there. Yes, let's go.
But yeah, you're right. Assurance is everything. And I also think that language probably breaks down. And look, I think this is a great segue because GRC feels like it's been a ceremony, right? It hasn't provided the level of assurance that we would want to report risk to the board. So, Conor, this might be a question for you. A CISO's telling the board a story, and Ayoub, I'd love your take on this as well, but historically, have we told board the story on the 0.07% on the 25 that everything is good?
Let me take that. So I'm going to give you my take on today, and then Ayoub, you're going to take us where we should be going. What should this look like on the other side? Because I'd say today what we do is there is a lot of trying to pull together disparate dots into a cohesive narrative. And every quarter, we're trying to we're not finding the data that supports the narrative, but we kind of arrive with a narrative and then look for the data. So every company is a little bit different, but ultimately, I'd say most security leaders in the seat today, every time they try and say, this is where we are from our security program, the load-bearing walls of that are going to be external audits. And then you say, last year we did this assessment and we did it. Here's how it contributed to ARR. We're good. And that's the story, which is not very helpful when you're trying to have a nuanced risk-based conversation on how are we going to bring AI agents into our coding pipelines to increase engineering velocity. That and your ISO 27001 do not live in the same room. Right. That's right. So that would be my take for today. Ayoub, like, what's your reaction to that, and how do we get past that?
I think it's a great point, and I think that's where also it's an abuse of the GRC term because there's both risk and compliance in the term, and they actually have very different objectives. Like compliance is very driven by if I can meet this bar, which is like a minimum bar, then everything's fine. Risk is more, okay, what could go wrong that actually could make my company go bust? And then from that, I would develop risk scenarios. I can understand like what security controls I can put in place. And what's challenging is if you push with compliance first, like it's a good story because of that selling aspect, but it's a bad story on the risk side because I passed, right? So
Mhm.
what's the issue? Up until next year, we should be fine. But like on the risk side, like the risk posture changes all the time. You kind of like appetite or your ability to take more risk, it has to also grow because the company wants to keep their competitive advantages and their moats and stuff. So it's a lot more dynamic in nature and it's a lot more tough to like, quantify and all that aspect that people often talk about. And I think for me, I want it, it's a funny phrase, but I almost want compliance to be more like observability. Like Datadog would almost be a GRC platform in a sense, and then risk be the only driver because compliance is mostly meta work around work that already happened elsewhere, right? We're just applying logic on.
Good point. Very
You know
good
what I mean?
point.
Because at the end of the day, like the work happened, the control owner could be a developer, could be a security engineer, could be finance, and I'm just testing like deterministic, more or less, right? Could be a boolean, like yes, true, false. On
Mhm.
okay, does 100% of the people that offboarded lost access to their Slack within 90 days? Yes or no? It's a lot. Like a lot of that could be codified at some point, but that is just like work about work. Like work happened and I just apply a compliance logic on top. But risk has a lot of those edges. It's a lot more non-deterministic in a sense, which means it's more probabilistic, which means we don't know if we're right. Like maybe, okay, I need a new solution on CSPM, or I need to hire an extra engineer and I don't have budget for one.
Right.
Maybe I buy the solution, migration goes horribly wrong, lots of bad stuff going on. The new engineer that I could have brought on, like that platform, the existing one hated it, he left. And then you know what I mean? But like you don't know. But for compliance, if you check that box, you'll get the candy at the end, So there's like it's different incentive structures because compliance is so deterministic and so easy to kind of prepare for and game almost in a sense.
So let's go down that rabbit hole a little further because I want to talk about one of the highlights out of your most recent State of the GRC report. So, in this recent report that you published, you surveyed over 800 practitioners on their number one GRC tool in 2026, and it is still a spreadsheet, for the love of God. 86% of GRC teams are relying on spreadsheets and manual processes. And what I found particularly notable was that it was 100% if your team had fewer of 5 or fewer practitioners on this. So let's go talk about let's go talk about this. Why are people still using spreadsheets in the moment that we have? Because when you went into GitLab, you built out the GRC program from scratch. You are GRC engineering. You took a very engineering approach to this. You've also released Corsair, which we'll circle back on. We'll talk about that technology. Why are people still coming back to spreadsheets? What's stopping them from getting out of spreadsheets and moving into the direction that you're trying to lead the community?
I don't want to demonize spreadsheets, okay? I think they're nice, okay? They're database without the brains, okay? That can work for stuff. I think the way I think about it is if your GRC program is not providing enough value, unfortunately, many times security leadership won't tell you. But if you never think you need to grow out of spreadsheets, it's probably because your program is not providing enough value. So it's almost like a circular argument where if you think, why would I need a GRC platform? It's just a spreadsheet with a UI. Then you don't think about connectors, managing 10 different frameworks, like helping teams that actually ship code in different ways in like more dynamic environments. What about runtime? What about like you testing the design of a control? Like, do we have the right guardrails and the policy? What about the effectiveness? Like, how about in practice? Okay, you review the Terraform plan, but maybe in the runtime doesn't look like it was in the plan. And all these things, like if you don't care about this, like none of these things can easily fit in a spreadsheet. It's more like graph. You need a different like mental model because Spreadsheet more looks like a relational database in a sense, with less kind of flexibility. So I think that's one part. And the other part is it's free. So the cost is not money. Everyone has access to Google Workspace or to the Office 365 suite. So technically you start for zero. And the issue is the cost is mostly opportunity cost of having impact that you can't have because of that platform. But the another big cost is a lot of lost time, because a lot of the complexity is hidden in different tabs in the spreadsheet. And the way it grows through complexity is very painful. But there's no one that can tell you if the program only cares about certs, because with a spreadsheet, you can pass every single cert. Like, it would never be an issue to pass compliance to use spreadsheets, because your auditors might use a spreadsheet to consume your stuff anyway, right? So it's they don't care about it, which means you need a different mental model to think about the GRC primitives, like the controls, the risk, the policies, and then you'll say, okay, I give you a quick example, right? Like we created, so leading GRC engineer at GitLab, we created our own GRC platform from scratch. And we focused a lot on the data model, so how it looked at the data layer. And something we found out is sometimes the compliance team would test controls around identity and access. Then the risk team might have one of the top 5 risks they report to the board, which is identity related. And then on the TPRM side, our IDP and maybe our PAM solution, they've been through the TPRM process, so they've been assessed as vendors. There's 3 different data points from 3 different sub-teams in GRC, which would all collate potentially to give you additional signal. So the compliance team could leverage what risk and TPRM did to test differently. You'll have more insights. And they were never sharing that data, because there's no way, and you can't do that in spreadsheets, right? Because the process of the program are completely different. And I think that's some of those kind of pain points that you only see if you care about assurance, because then going through the motion and getting certified is just an externality. It's not the outcome, which means if the outcome is assurance, then you have to redefine your program a little bit.
Got it. So if we're anchoring to the minimal viable compliance, then we will likely have a culture of saying, let's start with what's free. Let's, take the spreadsheet. And then we can never really build an intelligence layer because we're stuck inside of a spreadsheet. But if we go on what you're suggesting, having more of a graph approach where you do lean in on this, then you not only have the ability to demonstrate compliance, but then you can start your journey to assurance, because now you can have these risk conversations. That makes sense.
And also what I think I would say is like, typical with like the changes from, we see in agentic coding, right? Like people worked in IDE, and then like something like Corsair, like it kind of like a super powered IDE that has AI assisted coding. And then you have different harnesses, you can work in the terminal, etc. Like in GRC, most people in the industry right now, they've been trained in CPA firms, and they've been literally trained on being power users of Excel, on VLOOKUPs and pivot tables, and being extremely skilled. And it's a skill. It's like someone being a power user of Vim, and they know like the Vim motions very well, becoming less and less useful today. But they might have
Don't tell that to someone who knows Vim.
I'm just saying, like, it was a skill that was super valuable maybe a couple years ago, and I was like a very big differentiator in kind of like productivity. But now, like, to write prompts, it's not as useful. But it's like some of those skills that were like kind of like honing your craft, sharpening the saw as a practitioner, and Excel, and like just like understanding spreadsheets, like kind of software, and being very quick at using them. That was a big sharpening the saw for GRC professionals.
Zero Signal is brought to you by Hampton North. I've been responsible for building and turning around cybersecurity programs for companies where a lapse in security just isn't an option. Finance, high tech, AI. Different domains, but the same truth. The programs live and die on talent. And no strategy ships without the right people who share the right DNA. That's why I partner with Hampton North. I've built 3 cybersecurity teams with them, and every time they move faster than anyone else without sacrificing quality. While other agencies are still pushing paperwork, Hampton North already had vetted candidates in front of me. Their executive search is not one size fits all. With one of the largest networks of security leaders in the US, their leadership roles hit the market in days, sometimes hours. And their go-to-market practice covers CROs, CMOs, revenue leaders, and full team build-outs for scaling cybersecurity businesses. They meet every candidate, they reference every story. If you're ready to build and scale and grow your security program, go to hamptonnorth.com and see why brands like Clear, Instacart, Airtable, and OpenAI trust Hampton North to build great teams. Check out the link in the description. So something else to go after here is, let's just circle around the dollars. like running and building your compliance program and moving it towards an assurance program, we mentioned that you mentioned good insights. Like sometimes you just start with spreadsheets because they're free, but there's other things that are free too, and it's called open source software. So why don't you walk us through what you built with Corsair? I would really like to understand where this is, because I think this is a good example of the community saying enough is enough. We'd like to do something different here. So walk us through this platform that you've built. I'm really interested to see how this, and help us relate to, if you are the head of a TPRM product or you're the head of a GRC function at a technology company today, how would you engage with a project like this?
Yeah, 100%. So as I said, like it's kind of fairly new. So can I define Corsair in an easy way? For me, it's like almost the trust infrastructure for third-party risk management. So I didn't want to solve a problem that was like, okay, you want to review a vendor, they provide you with SOC 2, whatever. I'll use AI to review this because we'll get to a stage where AI writes the report and AI reviews the report. So it's like, it's more nodes for hallucination at some point. So we need to get, what I wanted is like just create the pipeline so the communication between the two entities can be trusted. So it has an npm package, brew. It also has a skill that is on the Vercel, a skills.sh. And for me, the goal, like when I think about it, I'm like, we have more and more vendors. Companies are faster and faster to adopt AI innovation, and they have less and less guardrails. Like a lot of CEOs are completely AI pilled. They're pushing that very hard on their companies, which means the time to kind of accept a new vendor could have been weeks and weeks before. It could have like be 3 or 4 days now, or like a day. Or So you have to be quick, but you don't have to provide less assurance. You actually have to provide more with less time. So if you have to assess thousands of vendors, for me, the way I think about the future is a human can scale to that level. So we need to find a way for an agent that is the producer of like that data to trust an agent as the consumer. And how me as like a TPRM team, I can have an agent that goes through all of the new vendors that we want to buy, and then I can define from that, okay, they shared with me like those 16 controls. What's the strength of each of them? Is the evidence like actually strong, coming from a good source of truth? What's the gaps? How can I think about the gaps? Should they remediate something? And then accept the risk with your eyes fully opened. So the way it looks in Corsair is like a big kind of crypto stack where you can create evidence. For example, started with stuff like Prowler, which is like an open source CSPM platform. And then they would create a report, and then you can sign it locally for your company. And then you can have a trust.txt page, which is almost like a trust center, but like you could just have a signature and you have the public key. And then someone can decrypt that data, see if the controls work, what was the result of the test, and then make a decision. Okay, like they're low risk, medium risk, should we ask for more? And for me, the incentive is I want to lower the barrier for people to share. So there is I would only use like open kind of protocols from IETF and some of those kind of bodies. And there's a way for you, depending on the domain, on who's asking, you can share more or less data. So if it's like a big, big, big vendor, maybe you share everything. And if it's like a very small vendor, you don't even know if they're actually like going to do something bad with that. You can share only one level. So you can nest it as far as you want. So I'm working now with PhD in crypto to actually make the crypto stack very strong, like the trust boundaries and everything. Because as you can tell, I'm not a PhD in crypto. I'm not even like an undergrad. So I'm just trying to make it has Merkle tree, like a lot of different approaches. But for me, the ulterior motive is I want to create the infrastructure so agents can talk to other agents about vendor risk and have trustworthy data they can trust. Because if I can trust a crypto stack in computation, I don't need a human auditor that actually stamps. And also, it can be in real time. So I can have signals that say they rerun the test 3 weeks later locally, like at the company level, and then actually a control that used to pass didn't pass. And I can get that signal directly coming in, and I can trust that signal is accurate. And then I can make a new decision and maybe ask for more or like change them in the rankings. So that's the idea in my brain. That's what I thought about.
Man, I love this. I love the fact that it's like, let's leverage math to build some trust here. We've been doing cryptography is
Yes.
pretty good. So I love your little tagline there of that we want to sell proof, not PDFs. It's like, that was well said.
Yes.
Love that. All right, so let's move on to, you mentioned like this future state of where AI is you end up having a world where if we go down this path you're describing, where we have agents that are from a TPRM side monitoring the trust page of someone else who's got agents who are putting up the evidence. Love that call. But in the interim here, we're also seeing a big change where the frontier AI models, whether that's just like Claude with some good skills or whether that's OpenAI with a good project, they're starting to eat the compliance stack of 5 years ago. So one of the things that you had shared with me was this prediction, or one of the things I'd read in the prediction was the state of GRC report, is that the next GRC platform isn't going to be a SaaS tool. And this goes in the direction you're talking about. So I want to expand on that. But it's really going to be this foundational model with the
Mhm.
right wrappers around it. So you actually had a conversation with the CEO of Vanta at RSA, if I remember correctly. So kind of walk me through your belief structure there. What does this mean for the GRC companies out there? What does this mean for where we should be thinking as practitioners, where these AI models start living in our mental model of how we operate these risk programs? Love to get your take on both sides of the house.
I love Christina. I'm close to most GRC CEOs. Okay, I don't make any favorites, but
No favorites, no enemies, right? That's the goal.
yeah, exactly. I love the industry. Okay, that's what I have to say anyway. For me, there's two ways. So there's how it impacts the vendor landscape, as you said, and how it impacts the practitioners. So the prediction I said is like this year spreadsheets were number one. Most likely next year, something like Cloud Co-work should be probably the first GRC platform. Could even be Notion, right? Of course, we made this big shift towards AI and having more like kind of all-purpose agents. It's already kind of a source of truth for many companies. Like for me, what will change is spreadsheets. They were there because of the legacy and how things were built, but they're done by nature. You have to apply logic on everything. Like you have to write the functions and build everything. With the new frontier labs, what they provide for you is the intelligence layer on tap, which means I have the data, hopefully less stale than before. Think about stuff like MCP, so I can connect directly to the source of truth. And then I can apply intelligence on that data just by prompting. So then for me, the change is before I have this data, so potentially I have the list of all the PRs and I have which ones had approvals or not. Today, I can ask the same question I used to ask about that data, but now also I can correlate it. I can say, okay, like, is there any patterns where we don't have the right kind of approvals? Is it also linking to specific sub teams? And I can nest and like have so many more questions around that same amount of data. And natively, it provides more assurance.
Right.
Because some insights I get as a GRC team, I'm very broad by nature, but the LLMs, they can get into the depth for me. I have to trust like and kind of verify, but the depth can be taken care of and the breadth is natively it's something that the GRC team has. So I think it empowers practitioners because they can be a lot more critical of platforms when they do the POCs because they're like, now with what I have and my own stack that I've built, I can do enough that I need to understand what's the actual mode, what's the thing that either is completely impossible for me to maintain if I build, or something where I can leverage the intelligence of everyone else who uses your platform. Some of like,
Yeah.
if I have 1 million people using, that's something that RAMP does very well. RAMP, they have an economist and they have all those things leveraging all the data from RAMP, and Stripe does the same. And that's some of the modes that you can't have. And, if I have 100,000 companies with similar kind of risk posture, it can give me insights on what controls I should harden or not. You can't have that if you're at n=1. Maybe if we build something open source, okay, you can have that.
Let's see where Corsair goes over the next 3 years.
Yeah,
There you go.
maybe that's the plan. So I would say for practitioners, I think it's overall empowering. You can do a lot more and get a lot more further by yourself. For vendors, I think it's the same for a lot of kind of AI-based companies, AI wrappers, whatever you want to call them. I think it's just like, in a sense, there's a difference between like having the intelligence and building an application around it. So I think for a lot of companies, like you'll still buy SaaS because you'll buy an outcome. And, I think in a sense, there's a lot of like craze around all this. But if you remember, like we had the same issue with SaaS. So before everyone was building everything in-house and even their infrastructure before public cloud. And at some point, we're like, okay, let's focus on our core business and outsource this. And then same with SaaS, let's not build a CRM, let's buy one. And Salesforce kind of invented SaaS in a sense. But I think now with AI, we're all empowered again. So want to be builders again. But then maintaining like infinite debug loops and like, I don't even understand the code. Why is this breaking? Like all these stuff will still happen for some times, even though the models are getting better. And at the end of the day, you want to buy off the problem and have it solved by someone else. And I think it's still the case. Like you can't buy the problem and give it to an agent for now. You might not like what comes out. I think for now, you still have to, in a sense, buy solutions. And I think the clearest example is like, Frontier Labs, they still buy software.
Yeah.
If they could have solved everything, why would they buy? They have security tools, why would they buy them? It's just the way I think about it. I'm like, if you want a dog food, as we often say in SaaS, like your own platform, like, why would buy anything?
We also want someone to shout at as well, right? Like innately, if something goes wrong, it can never be our fault. So I think
Exactly.
having software, it means we've got someone to be mad at and somebody to blame. So, and again, like we want to buy assurance. And if we're buying software, if we're buying GRC tooling, if something's wrong, it's not my fault. Even though it is, theoretically, it's your program. It's easier to be mad at said GRC vendor than ever to actually take any accountability. Look, I'm intrigued. The future of GRC programs, and look, I'm not talking about the like 0.01%, because I think those teams today are actually already at the cutting edge here. It's not the traditional like audit types. But what do you think in an average Fortune 500 company, and that's still very impressive, but what do you think their GRC team looks like in 3 years versus where it might be today?
Yeah, I would say, so I don't want to be doom and gloom, but in a sense, they might contract a little bit, I would say. Just because the phrase is weird, but what I said about meta work and work about work, like a lot of that GRC work has been translation from something that already exists to something that we can be shared thing ingest by an auditor or someone else. Like LLMs are very good at translation. It's
Yes.
very good at tweaking stuff. Explain to me like I'm 5. Okay, now I'm 6.5. How can you explain it to me then? And you think about it, I need to give it like the same piece of data. I need to give it to my CISO so they can prepare it for the board minutes. Now I need to give it to my auditor so they can leverage it and kind of assess my control posture. Now I need to give it to the head of SecOps so they can work on like new detection playbooks. And the same data could be like fed in different ways. And it's so easy now, which means in a sense, a lot of the work we've spent kind of trying to do that manually, it might go away. I think new GRC teams, I've seen that in Fortune 500 quite a bit. The net new hires are a lot more technical than the existing hires.
Mhm.
I think it's a lagging indicator because a lot of the new job postings are more like GRC engineer types, even though like often it's like, do you know Python? Okay, you're a GRC engineer. But they're a lot more like the median technical skill of the new hires is way, way, way higher than all the existing ones. And I've spoken to a lot of GRC leaders at big B2B SaaS companies, and they're trying to see, should I upskill existing staff? Should I just hire and then through attrition kind of make the team more technical? Or should I reshuffle the team completely? And there's a couple of very big ones where, trying to really think about, okay, just inherited this. I'm a security engineer by trade. I want to engineer this GRC team. What should I do? And I think what's tough now is really that you need a more technical team because the control landscape and threat landscape is more technical. So I think slowly they'll probably get smaller, probably get similar to a product team right now. So you have a PM that might be like the SME GRC, you have engineers, and then you might have a designer. So someone that does a lot of that work with kind of making the experience delightful for people that consume GRC activities. And then you might have kind of a PM, a PM more like a technical program manager, and that person does more of the stakeholder management and all that stuff. So it might look more like that versus the way we're like everyone is a TPM right now in GRC kind of.
So you don't think it will disappear entirely, given you gave yourself 80% on deathbyclaude.com?
Yes, that's sad, right? It's like almost, I'm finding the best way to be out of a job at some point. But no, for now, people are still hiring developers, even though the biggest use case for AI right now has been, kind of like churning out code. So I'm like, I think we still have some runway, and I think they'll probably shift and focus on more complex problems. It's just hopefully by getting closer to the source of truth, we might work on more interesting problems.
Yeah.
And actually, like a phrase I like to say is, Conor, your CISO, the phrase I really like is a GRC team's like best thing they could hear is like if the CISO comes to them and say, you just given me a piece of information I couldn't get any other way.
I want you to expand on that. This is what I was like desperate to ask you this question, because I was like, I've run security programs for so long and I've got all these GRC experiences, but by a small caveat, 7 years ago, I hired my very first GRC engineer. I'd like to know I was early to that trend, so you'd be proud of me.
I
But
love this.
one of the things I say with that is that GRC tends to be in an audit loop. We literally sit down at the beginning of the year and we build out our compliance calendar. Then we work back into what's changed, to where's our space, white space for projects and this, that, and the other. But it's so easy to anchor to a compliance schedule. So tell me more about that. How do we get people out of this audit ready loop, audit ready trap, might I say, into what you just described there, where I as a CISO can come walk in and say, like, I never connected those dots before. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's like there's a lot of like more process driven and like granular things, but I think it's mostly a mindset shift because what you described about the audit calendar is like so accurate, right? It's literally all the audit periods is the first thing we label on the roadmap, and then we build from that because then there's the audit prep. And then there's the walkthroughs, and then there's like evidence collection. So by the time you've added every single audit driven activity, like what's left, right? It's like maybe a month or two out of the whole year. And I think that's really the issue is like audit should be a byproduct of your security program. It shouldn't be the outcome. So, because at the end of the day, what's
Can I give you a standing ovation on my own podcast? Like, you just say that one more time, one more time.
no, but because like really, and I had that in a newsletter once. It was like, you should have a threat-driven GRC program and not an audit-driven one. Because the main issue I see we've been like focusing so much on audits is like there's this law that says if you have X amount of time to do a task, you take that full amount of time by design. And I think if you say audit is the number one activity for this year, then you just expend any audit activity to fill up all that time. And for me,
Parkinson's
if
law.
audit,
That's it.
yeah,
Parkinson's law. That's it.
exactly. So I really like that because I think like if you think about GRC and the three letters, like C is like 80, 90%. And like R, hopefully 10%, and G is maybe zero, maybe -5, right? I think the issue is the CISO sees that when they review the roadmap, they're like, okay, we have the SecOps roadmap, the infra, and this the GRC roadmap, and you just see audits, audit prep, audit cycle, and remediation cycles on the audit findings and all this stuff. And for me, I'm like, okay, when you build your roadmap, let's say that you test controls because we care about those controls. You don't test controls because an auditor is asking for it.
Mhm.
Build your roadmap with that primitive in mind, because if the control is only for compliance, then make it only for compliance. Make it check the box. We don't care. Do a screenshot. If there's controls that are in the standards, they're also super useful for the security team, then, focus on actually understanding the level of depth needed to impact it. Because one thing that we often underestimate is compliance can be a good way sometimes for security to win battles against the devs or the infra team, right? Sometimes, you need more hardening on the local endpoints, and you have a lot of pushback from devs because they really like a ton of access on the local endpoint. And then if compliance comes in, it almost like fakes, hey, we have this ISO standard and it says something about endpoints, blah, blah, blah. And then the corporate security team leverages that to potentially get an additional edge they didn't have and enforce a new security control. Like it's a huge win. It's not related to any control. An auditor would never ask about this because it might be related to like AR harness and how they use like, I don't know, assisted coding locally and having like pre-tool use hooks and stuff like this, right? But that win is huge for the GRC team. But it would never be showcased if you have an audit-driven program. But if you care about threats and you actually speak to the teams that care about threats, then the landscape and like it's almost like you need to build a control catalog without thinking about frameworks, and you mostly care about the risks. So, what risks do I have, and which control are actually mitigating those risks?
Mhm.
And all the framework-related risks, they're just here for that. They're here for compliance, but we need to be more cynical and less like we should like let's think about them as like the good in and of themselves, the good because of the outcome they provide for us.
I think that's a really good point. There's one thing I wanted to follow up on there. Like we gotta look into the glass here, the future, and ask the question: if we go down this path of continuous assurance that you're describing, and we really start to get this becoming a periodic, move away from periodic exercise that becomes really continuous, does that change who owns this program? Like in a future state, right? In your death by Claude, you have achieved what you're saying, and we've moved away, and we're now we're totally going down this path of continuous assurance or engineering for GRC. Does GRC stay its own function, or does it collapse under engineering?
It's something I think often about because I'm like, we think about GRC, like every single control is owned by someone. So like a security control would be owned by security engineering, or like a finance control would be owned by finance. And as GRC teams, we don't own controls because it would be a breach of independence. And same with risks. Like if I am related, like kind of access privilege, leveraging and like accessing PI data, like we don't own that risk. The actual owner is the head of infra or someone like this. So if we don't own any risk and we don't own any controls, like once again, we're a translation team. And we kind of make sense of complexity and kind of give net new insights based on that. But it's almost like, I don't know why this analogy comes to mind, but almost like in a CSVM platform, you have an agent running on like every workload and it kind of push back data, like a health check back to the control plane. Like the GRC team would be that control plane. But the actual agents running, like none of them is owned by GRC. We just care about the telemetry it gives back to the control plane. So almost a team that its activities would just be embedded in daily activities. It's almost like you have a JSON file and you have an extra kind of key value pair for GRC, but you just ship the file with a new key value pair, but everything else would be the same. So, but that's a bit sad because, means I'll either be retired.
I liked what you said, though. If we go down this path and we realize this, it puts us on a path for continuous assurance and it moves us out of compliance and into risk. That is the language of the business. That is why they hire CISOs. This is why we have a security program, is to mitigate threats from risk, threat actors. So the rest, and also bring, I always said this well. Someone said this to me once when I first started as a CISO. They said the job of a CISO is to discover, price, and coach. We find the risk, we price it in the terms of the business, and then we coach them through the remediation. And I like the vision you're setting out because with what you're doing and the work that you're doing, we can now move away from just trying to check boxes and get certifications and start having insights based on risk-oriented data.
That's the plan. Nice. Nicely said. I like it.
Ayoub, thank you so much for coming on the show, mate. I mean, we could do this for hours. We probably will at Black Hat. I'm going to go ping you about that. We'll have some fun with that. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's been an absolute awesome conversation.
I loved it. It was great. Amazing questions as well. And yeah, really good podcast, top level guest. And I like the name is very nice. The name is very nice.
We nearly strayed away. So we're glad to hear that. We tested some others and Zero Signal's here to stay.
Yeah, I like it. Very well chosen.
Thanks for coming on.
Of course. Cheers.
If today's conversation gave you something useful, a framework, a question worth sitting with, a way to position something you're already dealing with, that's the point. Connect with Conor and I on LinkedIn. The links are in the show notes. Tell us what landed.
And if you know another security leader who's navigating the same pressure, text them this episode. We'll see you next time.